Control Resonant sees developer Remedy Entertainment take one step further into the world of RPGs, following its first experiments with the original Control. But this isn't a studio that likes to follow conventions. Rather than rewarding you with XP for finishing missions, taking down bosses, and completing side activities as most games in the genre would, Resonant hands upgrades to the world around you. The open zones of this corrupted Manhattan react to you defeating the big threats infecting it, growing much more dangerous with each new zone conquered. We've already taken a look at how this sequel's combat has evolved, but now it's time to see how the threats you'll be taking down have changed in turn. As Control's story expands beyond the shifting walls of the oldest house, so too have the otherworldly entities that once called it home. Much like how the Bureau's headquarters was made up of a series of unique areas infested by the hiss and the mold, each of Manhattan's zones finds itself swarmed with these familiar forces, albeit not quite how you remember them. Chief among them are the eerie red-hued hiss, the paranatural parasite that corrupted Resonant's protagonist Dylan in the original Control.
You see hiss in this kind of a more, let's say, simpler form in the first game, but as it's getting out into the kind of outside world, it almost as if it's like evolution and process, like that kind of a turbulence and corruption goes to the next level and it gets way more violent and complicated and so on. It starts to even affect the kind of a basic environment as well, not just human beings.
I can attest to this. Having played a few hours of Resonant now, I've been forced to fight all manner of possessed entities, ranging from gangly eldritch monsters and giants with 2-ton sacks of glowing red goo for heads, with which they attempt to flatten you like a mallet, to an upturned bus emanating haunting passenger groans as it spun above me.
We had fun thinking about this, so from the world building point of view, his has been cooking and getting stronger as a resonance, and it can corrupt more things and bigger things, and naturally even outside of the oldest house we might actually have more opportunities to play around with things, much like this paper design for a large enemy that is this sort of a spawner type. So we were thinking that how can we actually do something like this in the world of Control. As a hissified bus made most sense, and then the fact that the poor passengers inside then became these hissified, like spawned enemies.
Also returning is the mold, the bacterial threat found in the depths of the oldest house in the original Control. These fuzzy fungal fiends have carved out their own pocket of New York, caking subway walls in blue and yellow mycelium and armoring themselves in layers designed to challenge Dylan's melee-centered skill set.
A lot of the reasons why it's different to fight them is because the hiss is it's the majority of enemies are hiss in Manhattan, but mold are kind of a more isolated faction there. There's still quite a lot of mold enemies, but what we were able to do is we were able to give them some special properties as a faction, and they are distinct visually but also gameplay-wise. They're not just a different color of his enemy. One way in which they're different is that they are soft. And they look soft, and they're made out of this kind of spongy mold material, and because of that they are naturally resistant to blunt damage. On the other hand, some of that material has calcified on them, and you can break it with blunt damage. So you need to then try to pay attention of okay, this enemy has armor from the front, maybe I go behind and I hit it, or maybe I pull out my big hammer and smash its armor, and then I can attack it afterwards.
Fighting the mold leads to combat dances performed to a different beat than those with the hiss. They're often more considered encounters, framed around knowing which enemies to target first, and taking in your surroundings so as not to get caught up in the traps they've set.
they're also much slower, and they don't necessarily attack you until you actually engage them or until you get really close to them. So there's a little bit of like, I don't want to say stealth, but there's more of like, they're not actually necessarily actively caring about attacking Dylan. They're just kind of there, and their job is to just, infect everything with mold, including you. So there's going to be damage zones, and they're covering the encounter area with the mold damage zones that create these spore clouds that inflict status effects. There are mines in the air and on the ground that you have to avoid. And there's also these mold alarms which trigger nearby encounters if you get too close to one. And burning all of that stuff is really fun because mold is afraid of fire.
You'll get the ability to burst into flames and fry up some mushrooms as you progress through Control Resonant's story. Progression doesn't quite work how you might expect for an action RPG though, with traditional character leveling systems discarded in favour of one that connects you in the world in a uniquely Remedy way.
Every zone has XP meter, so Dylan doesn't get XP, but zones do. And every time you do an activity in a zone, you get some XP for that zone. And every time the zone levels up, you get the zone improvement. So zone improvements are things that increase, for instance, health drops while you are doing activities in that zone further. Or for instance, they can reveal loot chests on the map. So now that when you're in that zone, it's going to be easier to find like rare loot. Or they can open up arcade cabinets, which are these challenge missions that you can do later in the game once you're more powerful, and so on and so forth. But also every time you level up a zone, you get a talent point. And that's more kind of classic action RPG/RPG progression where you leveled up and you get an extra ability point. Well, talent points are that, but you do get them from the zones.
There's only one set difficulty level in Control Resonant, as the team believes that they are making a well-balanced yet challenging experience. Though assist modes will be available to help out those struggling, Remedy encourages everyone to try to play Resonant how it has been intentionally designed, before tweaking it for themselves. And even if you do ultimately dial in some assists, it's worth experiencing one of Remedy's methods for that fine-tuned balancing act. An enemy scaling system that sees the whole of Manhattan react when you take down one of its big bosses, the Resonance.
Enemies do have levels in the game, and they do get harder as you get into further zones. That doesn't have really anything to do directly with the zone improvement system, but every time you kill a Resonant, which is one of these big bosses that are really kind of like tentpole fights, that once you kill Resonant, you get an ability, but it fights back, and it fights back by creating more threats for you in the world. So once you defeat a Resonant, combat encounters throughout the world, not just in the zone where you fought the boss, will respawn. New enemies are going to appear that weren't there before, and a lot of the encounters are going to level up. So you need to be strategic about like when do you want to do that, because you are going to grow in power a lot once you kill a Resonant, but also the world is going to get quite a lot of new threats, and there's going to be new challenges for you to overcome.
I've only played through a couple of the Resonant boss fights during my hands-on time, but from these brief encounters, it's clear to see that Remedy has placed a lot more thought into boss design this time around. Not only that, but they feel better woven into the central set of missions than they did in the original Control, where they were frequently positioned as optional adversaries.
I think you will have a really hard time finding two bosses that are anything like each other in this game. They're actually quite different from each other, and that is intentional because we again want you to have that like amusement park ride experience in it. We want you to come in there and get this sense of awe and wonder, and also they test very different skills. Every boss by definition is a skill check, and some bosses you're going to have a harder time with some builds than others, so you will want to think a little bit about like, okay, what artifact do I want to equip in this one? What are the damage types that I'm dealing with here? Like, is it better to attack it from range, or is it better to stay up close?
In our previous drop of this IGN First, we showed off a full fight against the Central Resonant, a mammoth magma-splurging beast that certainly poses a challenge. It tests your grasp of Dylan's floating ability as the floor literally becomes lava. Visually, its stumbling off-kilterness is in stark contrast to the game's first boss, a giant yet deadly face which dazzles in its hypnotically kaleidoscopic imagery. This is due to patterning, a brand new paranatural threat that is rivaling the hiss and mold for ownership of Manhattan.
It transforms the cityscape in this weird algorithmic pattern, and often case you find these resonants, former persons of power, at some sort of a focal point or an anchor point of this localized patterning. So this poor person somehow becomes amalgamated into the surroundings as well, so it's not just the person but becomes part of the environment.
After defeating this first boss, you're left to tackle the other resonants in any order of your choosing, although not all of them must be taken down in order to see the story's end. It's a further example of choice making its way into each aspect of Control Resonant, whether that be when build crafting in its menus, the moment-to-moment beats of battle, or deciding whether taking down all of its bosses is worth the payoff of angering the paranatural New York that birthed them. That's for you to decide. For more from our Control Resonant IGM first, check out our feature all about how combat has evolved, and for everything else, stick with IGM.